Y'all, could I be more excited about my guest today? It's my podcast coach, Krystal Proffitt, host of the Proffitt Podcast and author of Start a Binge-Worthy Podcast. If you're a super fan of the show Friends, like Krystal and I are, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say Krystal is my marketing lobster. I first saw Krystal speak at the inaugural Spark Media Conference for Christian podcasters in 2020, and starting a podcast wasn't even on my radar. I was there just to learn and build relationships with podcast hosts, but I was on the edge of my seat taking notes like crazy on how to launch a podcast because everything she was talking about was everything I love, marketing. And I love listening to podcasts. I love supporting my friends who are podcast hosts. And as y'all know, I love pitching podcast hosts. So I really love everything podcasting and, of course, everything book marketing. So when Krystal launched her Start a Binge-Worthy Podcast book a year ago, I couldn't wait to get my copy, and I have loved how it comes so naturally for her to talk about her book on her podcast. It never gets old, and I refer to it often. Week in and week out, her book, her podcast, her YouTube channel, her course, her coaching have all helped me to launch this podcast. She's released over 700 podcast episodes, y'all, and they're all jam-packed full of value. She is the real deal. And hearing her share that the content of her book came from her podcast episodes, I couldn't wait to have her as a guest to dig in to what all that entails and just to bend her ear on book marketing and podcasting and all the things. We don't call this book marketing mania for nothing. So let's get to it. Hey, Krystal, welcome to the Book Marketing Mania podcast. I'm so glad you're here today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Kim. I always love when we can nerd out on books and marketing and podcasts and all the things. So I'm excited to chat with you.
Oh, me too. So everybody heard me gush about you in the introduction. I'm just so thankful. They would not be listening to this podcast if it wasn't for you. So I so appreciate all your support in helping me get started podcasting. So I wanted to ask you, we did a whole episode on how the different Enneagram numbers approach book marketing. And so I would love for everybody to hear what your Enneagram number is.
Yes. So I am a 3, being the achiever and like just a goal oriented. I'm always, as soon as I launch something, I'm always thinking about, well, what's the next thing? And what's the next thing? I'm always thinking of the next goal that I'm going to achieve. And I'm so glad that you asked this question because I think that I never understood that about myself until I took the Enneagram quiz. And even still, whenever I learn what other people's numbers are, I'm like, oh, this makes so much more sense. Like I know who you are as a person, like on a deep fundamental level now. So I love that you talk about this because we are different. We're so different.
Yeah, we are. It's so fun. I think it's when you know that kind of going into it, then you're listening to somebody talk and you're like, oh yeah, that sounds so like me, or that sounds like somebody else I work with. I've worked with a lot of 3s. So, hey, so our audience is all nonfiction authors, or they may be bloggers looking to publish a book, a nonfiction book in the near future. And so I just wanted to ask you first, we had Misty Phillip on the show, which everybody heard in my introduction. That's kind of how I even found you, was you speaking at Spark. And she talked all about, podcasting for authors, but I'd love for you just to share a little tidbit from your own experience, Krystal, of just the power you see in podcasting and why you would encourage authors to maybe start a podcast.
Yeah, this is such a great question because I attended, if everybody's familiar, I know we may not have a bunch of like children book authors, but I attended, and I always mess up the letters. It's SCBWI. Is that what it is? Like the Society of Children Book Writers and Illustrators. So I attended one of those. This was back in 2017 because I just published my first book. I'd self-published and I was like, oh, well, maybe I want to write a children's book. And it was at that conference, I met several literary agents and heard them speaking on stage, and they all kind of had the same thing. It's not about how big your audience is. It's about having an audience that you understand what they want, what they need, and being able to deliver that to them. And so that's kind of stuck with me as I continue to write books and create content. I think, well, it's not just about how many Instagram followers I have or how many people I have listening to my podcast. It's all of it working together. And I think that while social media is fantastic and absolutely has its place in marketing and getting the word out there, there's nothing like a podcast to feel the intimacy of knowing that person. And so for anybody that's listening and you're thinking about, okay, I want to write this book and I want it to be for this specific audience. A podcast can 100% lay the foundation for the stories that you would tell in a book, or for you to have the ability to elaborate in places where you just feel like, oh my gosh, if I keep talking about this, I'm going to go on for 5 or 6 chapters and it just needs to be one chapter and I don't have enough time. Well, that's where you can share more of those stories on a podcast, and you can grow really the authority in your field, especially for you nonfiction writers that are in a specific space where you want to stand out as the go-to expert. I think that a podcast can just help you achieve that in so many ways.
Yeah, because I know so many of our authors they've considered starting a podcast, or some, might be podcasting and they're just trying to figure out, is this what I want to keep doing for my ministry or my business? So that is what I wanted to kind of dig into with you, Krystal, is because you are a self-published author of 2 nonfiction books, right? But the one we want to talk about today is Start a Binge-Worthy Podcast. And so I wanted to dig in because I know my listeners are all interested in starting a podcast and marketing, and we're going to talk about that too. But I really wanted them to see kind of the end result of, how you can take your podcast and put it into book like what you have done. So I would love for you to share a little bit about what that journey looked like for you to take your podcast content and turn it into a book. And maybe if somebody's thinking about doing that, maybe some lessons learned along the way that you would share with them of some things you might do differently if you were to do it again.
Yeah. This is such a great topic because I think that a lot of people come to me and say, I don't have any good ideas, or I have one good idea and that's about it. And I'm like, no. I promise you, if we were to sit down, I could pull out so many ideas and strengths and just incredible things that you can talk about on a podcast. And so whenever I looked at all of my content and I said, you know what, I think I want to write another book. I think I want to write it about podcasting. I had that fear that sank in that said, you don't know what you're doing. You haven't been doing this long enough, because whenever I started on that book, I had just switched to podcast coaching maybe 6 months before I started writing that book. And I said, I'm going to do this. So all of the imposter syndrome was creeping in. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. You haven't been doing this for decades. You can't write a book on this. You can't be the authority. So for anybody that's listening, imposter syndrome, it hits everybody. It hits everybody in different ways, for sure. So you're not alone if you felt any of that. But what I did is I didn't look at all the blog posts that I'd done and the podcast episodes and say, okay, I'm just going to start with episode 1 and I'm going to turn all of this into a book. I don't think that's the right idea. What I did instead is I looked at all of my different pieces of content from my podcast, from my course, from some YouTube videos that I had done. And I said, what's the best content? Not what is all of the content, but what are the best pieces of content? And so I think that for anybody that's looking at content that they already have and they want to use it as a book format, look at your best stuff, not all of it, because not everything is going to be worthy to be put into a book. But I think if you start with your best stuff, then from there you can decide, okay, now I can tell a story around this. Because I mean, Kim, I could tell you, I searched Amazon. There were so many books on just how to start a podcast. But I named my book, How to Start a Binge-Worthy Podcast, because it was deeper. It wasn't just how to throw something out there. It was, how do you keep listeners coming back every single week? Well, not all of my content was worthy of that. I had to pick and choose which pieces were going to be the best for a book. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. So did you know before I'm guessing the answer is no, right? That whenever you first started podcasting, did you think in your mind, I'm going to do this because I want to write a book?
No, it wasn't. Writing a book has been a dream of mine long before podcasting. But it wasn't, I'm going to start podcasting and then I'll eventually write a book. That just kind of felt like the next natural step because I had already self-published a book before. I knew the ins and outs of it. I did it whenever it was still CreateSpace. It's now like Kindle Direct Publishing, which, by the way, everybody doing it now is so much easier than it used to be for sure. But I mean, I already knew the steps. So I knew it was possible. I had the confidence because I was like, well, even if things have changed a little bit, I know it's going to be easier than the very first time that I do it. So for any first time authors, like, it is 100% doable. And I think that the goals are different from book to book. So my very first book, I just wanted to see my name on a book cover. That's really the biggest thing is I was like, I just don't want this content I'd been creating to just be lost to an oblivion. So I turned what was my blog post into a book. And then for the second one, my goal was to get on a bestseller list. And I made that happen. I made the Amazon bestseller list. And then my next book, I have another book that I'm going to start working on soon is I want that one to be traditionally published. So each one has a different goal. And I think that you have to decide what that goal is whenever you're writing your book. That way you know what to focus on.
That's so good. Yeah. Because I think there's so many people that they're thinking, well, maybe I want to start a podcast. Maybe I want to write a book, but then there's others that like they've been blogging forever. And so they have so much content that they maybe could turn into their podcast and turn into a book too. So I can see both of them kind of go in that direction. That's why I was just kind of curious if that was your goal in mind, because I think some people that might be their goal, but some they might be thinking, well, I don't know, but it's such a great way to test out the content. So I know that you did an episode, and I'm going to definitely link it in the show notes, all about how to turn your podcast into a book, like definitely the step-by-step process. And it's so funny because I think it's cool the way God works that today you're my guest because my episode that went live today is with Barb Bruce. His is a literary agent. And she was talking about, how important it is to know that you have content. Well, first off, just really know your stuff, right? Like you do, podcasting, be really familiar with your content and then have had kind of a way to test that content and know it's resonating with your readers, right? And you've built up a platform somewhat, and that you just talked about that, like how she talked about, just making sure where your book's going to fit into the ream of books, right? There could be a bunch of podcasting books, but you really nailed down where your book is going to fall in line. So I love that it all just you're talking about stuff that she was laying down on the podcast today. So yeah, I think that's awesome. So cool. And of course she's an agent and, trying to do that with traditionally published authors. So I think that's fun that's next step on your journey, possibly. So is there anything when you went through that process? And again, I know there's multiple steps to it and I'll share the link in the show notes to that episode where you kind of nailed it down, but I'd love to just hear, were there any steps along the way that you were like, oh gosh, I wish I would have done it differently if I had to do it over again?
Well, I have a different perspective on writing and being an author than someone who maybe has a traditional background in another area. So my background is marketing, through and through. I have a marketing degree. It's what I'm passionate. It's I'm the nerdy marketing person. If you look at all my books on my bookshelf, it's all business marketing books. I can't get enough of it. I love it so much. And so for anybody that's listening, and what I did not do with my first book, and I know we're talking about my second one, but this is the lesson that I brought into my second book, is having that launch date. If you are going to be self-publishing and you have control over when the date is going to happen, you got to pick a launch date, because people will tell me, well, I could write a book, have it edited, formatted, and published in 6 months. Why do I need to push it out for a year? Well, I heard this conversation. It was between Christy Wright and Stu McLaren, and y'all can go find this on YouTube. It was the best analogy of having a launch runway. But whenever you have a date that people can work backwards from, you have this ability to build excitement, anticipation, whether it's 90 days or 6 months. You have to have a runway built in, because just writing the book is only half the battle. If that's your only goal, which that was my goal for my very first book, I just wanted to finish it and have a printed physical copy of a book in my hands. That was the dream for me. And I accomplished that. And I was like, okay, give myself a pat on the back. That was awesome. The next time around, I said, I want to do this right. And I knew that marketing the book was going to be the next thing I wanted to learn. So, and I know that you talk about marketing so much. And I think that this isn't talked about enough for authors. I think everybody focuses so much on the content and the writing and the format, but I'm a big believer in sharing the whole journey with your audience can be the easiest marketing that you do. And it's messy. And yeah, I'll take a video of me when I'm typing in the morning and I share it, and people are like, oh, okay, I guess Krystal's writing again. But what you're doing is you're planting those seeds along the way, and people can see, dang, she's been working on this for 6 months. She's still doing this thing. And I will absolutely go buy her book when it comes out, because I know how hard she's been working on it behind the scenes. So that's how I feel about it. I think that having that launch date is super, super important. And if you're going the traditionally published route, then you will likely be told your launch date of this is when it's coming, but you'll still know it. You'll know it well in advance. So I think that you should start your marketing as soon as you know when the book is going to be available for sale.
Yeah, I think that's so good to, like you said, on the self-published, to set a date for yourself. Because I know that's so hard, right? We keep pushing it out and pushing out and pushing out, and then we never get around to doing it. And it doesn't give us that kind of runway to start talking about it. Because I know oftentimes it's the self-published authors, we wait till we get the book in hand, right? Because then that's when you think, oh, now I'm going to start my marketing because I have my book out. Versus, I know for you, you had mentioned on the podcast that you started talking about your book way back when, right? I mean, like I think I saw you speak at Spark in February of 2020. And I think you probably mentioned you had a book coming out in the fall, or that you were working on your book. And it's like, oh, wow. Then you start building that excitement of what's to come in the future for sure.
Absolutely.
And I heard also on your podcast, and I'll be sure and put a link in this because I just interviewed Thomas Umstattd. And I was just saying, I just love the episode you had on your show where he coached you through your book marketing and just really looking at what you were going to do ahead of time and, you know, what resources you had to use and how much time you were going to spend on that. And he talked a lot about, you know, which is, I guess, what we just kind of talked about, kind of that pre-promotional period where you're really just in platform building mode until you get to the promotional period where you're hardcore sharing about your book. So is there anything you wish you would have done differently in that pre-promotional period? Because I think that's what we're kind of focused on, is like thinking about the time that we don't always give to the before the book comes out. Is there anything you would speak into that for our listeners, just to know that, yeah, it is important to start sharing early? Because I know people get afraid to do that. Like they don't want to give away too much information, but how important it is. And again, how a podcast can play into that.
Yeah, I think that people do get to like, well, if I share clips of the book, I say clips, you know what I mean? Snippets of the book, quotes from the book, then why would people read it, right? If you do that for 6 months straight, it's like there's nothing left. But I would challenge everybody to think about their content in a different way, because let's say I was an author writing a book about ministry, right? I wanted to write about ministry. Well, instead of giving the steps away in the book that you're going to talk about or the stories, you could talk about what inspired you to write the book, right? So you could create little clips that you share on Instagram, or you put on YouTube, or you put it somewhere else. So it's a different way of marketing, because you're not sharing the book, you're sharing your inspiration behind the book. Or maybe you're sharing things that, like, I like to tell stories about, well, this is where I really messed up. I always talk about, Kim knows this, I always talk about my mistakes. And it's what I like to do, because it brings the humanity into it. And it brings you down to a level of relatability, because even though I want to be an authority in my field, I also share the messy stuff in between, because that allows people to, even though I may be several steps ahead of them, that they're like, she knows me. She knows what I'm going through. So anytime you can add in those little elements, or just share, like take a selfie of, you know, you're writing in the morning, it's 5 a.m. in the morning before your kids wake up, and you're like, oh, or it's a Saturday afternoon and everybody's out of the house. Like, just share those little clips along the way in the pre-promotion period, or you get the first, you know, cover of your book, you get your first proof back, share that on social media, email it to your list, because the more involved people feel along the journey, again, like I said earlier, the more excited they're going to be, like, man, we have seen her working so hard this whole time. It's almost, I don't want to call it like a pity purchase, but it's almost like, even if I'm not going to read this book, then I just want to support her. Like, even if I'm just going to give it away to somebody else, I want to support her, because I have seen all the hard work that she's put into this. And it's like an applause, right? It's a way to support authors for sure.
Yeah. And then that's all part of marketing, right? You're talking about your marketing background. I mean, it's just so fun because we think of that as marketing, but I know often as authors, we don't think about that, right? We don't think about it until after we get the book, but then you've missed out on all that runway where you could have been sharing all those different things. And I know, like, when I've heard an author on a podcast, I mean, you know, when you hear their voice ahead of the book launch and then the book comes out and you're like, oh man, I really want to get the audiobook because I love their voice and I've really connected with them. And yeah, you just want to support them in any way you can. Talk about, you know, like, on your podcast, again, because you podcast and your book is about podcasting, but I think that would be very similar to a lot of people in our audience that talk about, like the Christian living space. And so they'd probably start a podcast around that. And they might have a certain niche in that. And then their book's probably going to be about that. Right. And so talk a little bit about how you're really good about sharing about your book without sharing about your book, right? I mean, that's what we talk about. Like, how can you talk about your book without talking about your book in a salesy way? And so I'd love to kind of hear how you've been able to do that on your podcast, because you do it so seamlessly. And it's just a natural part of, when you're sharing content and then you're like, hey, if you'd like to dive into another resource, will you talk a little bit about how you've done that, like through your podcast episodes, as well as I'm going to let you give a little shout out to Buzzsprout's dynamic content, because you do this so well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it just goes back to, understanding where your book plays a role. And I think that this should happen for a lot of people before you even start writing. Like, you should know, what's the whole goal of this book? Like, what is the purpose? What's the core message of what you're trying to share? Because then you can know how that aligns with your audience. So I love the example that you gave. Someone's writing about Christian living, and that's what their content is about. It's what their podcast is about, their whole website is about, or whatever pieces of information that they're sending out on the internet or on social media. I think it's important that everything is aligned, but not overly salesy. And there's a very big difference, because if I say, Kim, I'm writing this book, it's going to help save you time, save you money, save you energy, save your marriage. Like, those are all things that you're like, oh, I want to know more about this book. But if I say, Kim, my book's $14, you should buy it, you're like, okay. Like, you have this wall that comes up. But if you start with the value that you're offering to your audience, for me, it's easier to talk about. I don't feel like I'm selling you anything, because I know how good my book is, because people have told me it's helped me get my podcast started. It's helped me feel more confident. Like, and these are actual social proof things that I have saved. I have screenshots from people in our Facebook group, or, in an Instagram post. I'll take a screenshot of that. And if I have their permission, I will share the person's name and their handle and everything. But if I don't, I'll cut all of that out and say, look, this person said that this book changed their life or helped them do this. And so using that social proof all along the way can really help you in your marketing efforts. But I'm not saying, Kim, my book is $14, you should go buy it. No one cares. No one cares about that, because I could go to Target and buy all kinds of things that are $14, but you have to know, what is the value that you're offering to your audience? And you always lead with that. And sometimes it will feel awkward in that, especially when you're heavily promoting. And I just got to tell you, just kind of push past that uncomfortableness, because everybody feels that. You feel like, man, I'm sick of hearing about my book because I've been talking about it for so long. But in the marketing world, that means that people are probably just now hearing it for the first time, because we get so much information. But once your book is launched, or you're even in the pre-launch phase, you can mention it subtly if you know how it adds value to people. Like, now I'll slip it in there from a few podcast episodes here and there, and it's not even intentional. Like, I don't have it in my notes to say, oh, plug the book. You need to talk about it. It's more of, oh, you know what? We talked about content calendars in my book. Like, you should go, like, if this is something you need help with, go check out my book. So I think everybody finds their own way to do this, but just lead with value every single time.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think, so many of the authors and bloggers tuning in can relate to that of, again, it's just sharing all the content that you have and just being very generous with it, right? And just offering up that invitation, like if it's a lead magnet or, something, I can just see how that would pop up in so many people's minds of, like, you're sharing something, a story, and you're like, oh, I wrote a blog post about this, or I have a printable, of verses that can help you through the struggle or whatever. I think that would be such a natural piece. So I know, obviously, with your podcast, marketing a podcasting book, I'm guessing your podcast played a big part in that and continues to play a big part in that. So I'd love to, I was going to ask you, what has been the biggest return? Has it been your podcast? Has it been social media? Has it been, your email list? Has it been traffic to your website? Because I know that's all areas that our audience would be looking into. So I'd love to hear what's been the most effective for you to reach new readers and market your book.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to, because we mentioned this earlier and I didn't touch on this piece of your question. So dynamic content, for anybody that's Yeah, that's listening for if you aren't familiar with what that is, that simply means adding an audio clip at the very beginning or at the very end of a podcast episode where you can say, hey, November 4th is coming, our brand new book. Here's where you can learn more about it. And then it's in front of every single episode. So I did do a ton of that. I did so much of that whenever it was like launch phase, like whenever you're heavily promoting everything, I did that. And now I've backed off of it because the book is out there. Like it's been there. And one of the secrets, like here's everybody lean in a little bit because I'm going to share with you my secret of how I keep my book top of mind is on my website from the very beginning. I knew this even goes back to my blogging days from way back in the day. I never wanted to do Google ads. I never wanted to have like any of those Mediavine or any of the like U-Haul and like trash bag, like ads, like I don't want that on my website. I don't want it because it drives me nuts whenever I go to someone's website and from Pinterest, especially I go to find a recipe on Pinterest. I go find it. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many pop-ups. I can't stand it. But it did give me the inspiration I have show notes on my website or blog post, if you want to think of them that way. And I have ads for my book on every single show note ever since it's been published. And all I've done is I just clone, and it's basically a copy and paste of the same format every single time. So any person from the day that my book launched to today can go to my website, click on any of the podcast episodes, and there's a link to buy my book. So I think that instead of saying, oh, how can I get other people to pay me for ads on my website? We say, how can we get paid for the things that we already created? And we put ads. I always like use quotes like ads for our own things, self-sponsored ads in our podcast, on our YouTube channel, on your website, like utilize the tools that you have at your disposal, social media, all of those to promote your own products and services. And a book is definitely up there. So back to your other question about which one has been the most profitable, I would have to say probably my podcast in the beginning. I think that that's where a lot of everybody needs a book launch team too, by the way. And having people on my book launch team and my podcast were the biggest. But now I think it's having it's that subtle reminder every time in my show notes for the book it's what helps. I still get sales every month for my book, and I think it's just a matter of just keeping it out there and letting people know that it's there.
Right. Because it's just a natural progression to what you've learned on the podcast that day to see that. And if you haven't gotten the book, you definitely should. So yeah, did you do a launch team for your book?
I did. And it wasn't, and it's funny that you mentioned the episode with Thomas because I did the opposite of what he told me to do. It's funny because he was like, he said, well, you shouldn't have people on your launch team that haven't paid for the book. But my launch team started well beyond the promotional period. Like, cause I think what he had in mind is what I see a lot of other launch teams doing. So they'll start about 90 days before the book is out. So it's a pre-order phase. So you can get people to order the book, but I'm like, well, Thomas, I want people like helping me. This was like 8 months before the book was out. So my launch team helped me pick the title of my book. They helped me pick the cover art. They helped me like figure out some of the chapters and the different like ordering of things. And it was really fun. And then in return, I gave them an advance copy of the book and just asked them to write a review whenever everything went out. And a lot of them were like, this was so fun. Thank you for sharing. They pre-ordered several copies whenever pre-orders actually came around. So that's the way that I did it. I think in the future, I will probably have an even smaller launch team that's kind of like the incubator, like the brain trust of what my last launch team was. And then I'll push for even more of a pre-order launch team that I've kind of seen on some other, because I've done several launches myself, like participating on other authors' launch teams. So y'all just learning so much from other people.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, I'm being inspired by what they're doing, but figuring out how you can do it yourself. Did you call it a quote unquote launch team, or was this like part of, I know you have a Facebook group for podcasters. Did you plug into that group, or was it like a separate launch team?
It was so it was a Facebook group, but it was like, I think I talked about it and promoted it in my Facebook group, my big one. And then I created a smaller one. So it wasn't huge. It ended up being like 25 people, I think, at the end. But it was so valuable because this is another secret. Ooh, I'm going to share all the secrets of my launches, because what I did is I would go live in that group and share things with them that I didn't want the whole world to know. But what ended up happening is I now had content in that group that I could strip down and use it for promotional purposes in the future. So it was like my diary of, hey guys, like, I'm stuck on this, or I'm trying to figure out this part of the book and I need help with this. So it was me documenting my journey publicly, but it was still private, if that makes sense. And then later on, I like stripped those videos out and I used it during my promotional period to show the behind the scenes. And I think a lot of people enjoyed seeing that as well.
Oh yeah. That's such a great idea. Because I know a lot of our audience might relate to, like, if they've had a focus group, like they'll usually pull a group together to read the book and give your input, but just to, again, go into that marketing mindset and how you can use all that for promotion is genius. So you're thinking about traditionally publishing next time. Yes. And I keep hearing that, publishers are looking for podcasters, and they really put a lot of weight on, people that host a podcast, whether it's an interview podcast or a solo podcast, just that you're obviously getting a message out there in a bigger way than you could other ways. So have you seen that, like, for yourself? I don't know if there's anything you want to share, no trade secrets, but anything you want to share that you're doing to build your platform for a traditional publisher, or how you've seen podcasting just as on its own play a part in that?
Yeah, I think that I have seen, it's funny because I'm actually, right before we hopped on our call today, I'm listening to, when this episode, I don't know when it's going to go out, but Susie Moore, who, if you're on familiar, Amy's, PR, she was just on Amy's today. And I was like, oh, this is so good, because I can just imagine what she did to have this interview with Amy. We're talking about Amy Porterfield's podcast. Oh my gosh, it's so amazing. And I've seen so many other people. If you go back and look at how authors have been on these stages and they talk about their books on podcast, go listen to them. Like, find your favorite authors, go listen to the podcast episodes that they've done, because what they're doing is they're not just talking about anything on a podcast. They are bringing everything back to their book. And I heard her say several times, and it was about like overcoming overwhelm and making things easy. And she used the keywords that she uses in her book multiple times. So it's almost like a subliminal message of like, well, I talk about this in my book, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. Or everything was driving back to the book. So for anybody that wants to grow a platform, if you're not currently podcasting and you're like, I don't really see a podcast in the future, be a podcast guest. This is the best thing that you can do, because it will grow your platform. It can grow your social media. It can grow your email list. It can get people watching your content in other places if you're somewhere else. And I think that it's the trade secret. It really is for growing anything. If you do have a podcast and you want to grow it before you publish your book, guesting on other people's shows is just the best way to connect with an audience, for sure.
Oh gosh, I'm so glad you said that, because, I love podcast pitching and podcast guesting. And I think it is just so amazing. And especially when you find guests like that. And I haven't listened to Amy's show today. It popped up in my player this morning. And I was like, oh, I would definitely want to listen to this, because I love Susie and I'm familiar with her book. And again, it's listening to those authors that they're not on the show to pitch their book, right? They're really just on the show to serve, but the book just naturally ties into it. Or it's just so easy for them to say, like what you just said, that, you could check out my book, or just mention the book, and you don't have to have a direct, ad necessarily to it, but it's just, the listeners hear that and they want to go check it out naturally after the fact. So I did want to ask you about that, because I'm curious, as a podcast host that gets pitched a lot of pitches, and I know you've had several episodes on this, would you just share, I'd love to just hear your thoughts for our audience on what your biggest pet peeve is with podcast pitches that you receive.
Oh, I'm laughing because Kim knows. She already knows. She already knows. We've had conversations behind the scenes about my biggest pet peeves. And my biggest one is people that don't lead with value. It's not personal. It's just, hey, I see you have a podcast. I'm amazing. That's basically what it is in a nutshell. All of these people that I either never reply to, or I just hit delete on them and never say anything back, is there's no connection. I feel that they have copy and pasted everything from a template, and they're just saying, my name is blank. This is what I've done. This is how amazing I am. And here's when I'm available to come and show my awesomeness on your podcast. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, it sounds so bad, but I'm like, I don't care about what you do. You have to make me care. So that's my biggest pet peeve. And the thing that I can tell you that will get a yes on my podcast, even if that person is not, like, if they're slightly outside of podcasting, like let's say someone does more of like the online business side, because that is part of who my audience is. But if it's not directly underneath the podcasting umbrella, I will still answer a pitch if someone has addressed me in a personal way. Either they don't have to say, I love your podcast, it's amazing, because I don't like all that either. That's kind of weird to me when people are overly too much. But when they say, I loved your episode specifically about blah, blah, blah with this person, or this was my biggest takeaway, and I could really speak to your audience on this topic because I wrote this book. So it all is just like a cyclical thing that like goes back to value. All of it goes back to value. What kind of value can you add to my audience? Not to me, because I'm not the center of attention here. I have my audience. They are the ones that I'm serving. And so I think a lot of times people will approach hosts as, I have to make the host happy, but I'm looking for content that will make my audience happy. So I think if you approach it with personality, how can I be, relatable to this person? How can I connect with them? And then how can I really hit home on the value that I could bring to them? I mean, it's going to get at least a contact. Like you would get a reply from me for sure.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great advice. Yeah. And you've got so many episodes on podcast pitching. That's awesome. For everybody should go listen to them, because there's all kinds of value bombs in there on how to provide value to the podcast host for sure that you're pitching. Hey, I wanted to ask you, you just released an episode today that I haven't had a chance to listen to all of it about a private podcast, but it made me think today, as we're going to talk about this, like how cool a private podcast would be as part of your launch plan, like maybe a pre-order bonus, or, it could be its own little podcast that just lives by itself and you never podcast again. So will you talk just a little bit about that? Because it did make me think. I was just like, oh my gosh, that would be the coolest idea. Because I've seen people, they might include like a single episode they've done, like an interview with somebody is kind of a cool thing to do. But, a lot of times something like that, it seems like the person you're interviewing gets a lot more exposure than your own book. So talk about maybe how authors could do that as part of a pre-order, or even just its own little podcast itself.
Yeah, I love this idea for a pre-order, because I know that a lot of authors, now I don't want to put all authors in a box, but a lot of authors that I know are pretty introverted. Like they're not all extroverted, like, oh, I would love to be on video and sign me up for YouTube. They're usually like, I am fine being in my house, in my office by myself with my keyboard. Like that's usually how a lot of authors are. And I respect that. And I think that with podcasting, there's not as much pressure to have this like big, like sales video and like, or a free masterclass. I see a lot of times that, especially recently, I was just watching, there was another author that just released a book, and he was releasing like a mini course. It was like, oh, it's like 4 or 5 videos and they were 20 minutes long. And I was like, that's a lot. That is a lot for someone to do, especially for those of you that are solopreneurs and you're doing all of this yourself. But what I would love for you to think about is a private podcast that has that same type of content. So back to what we were talking about earlier, this could be like information that's like the inspiration behind the book. Or it could be, hey, you know what? I kind of teased this story in the book, but I didn't go into depth and detail, but I do on the podcast. So when you pre-order the book, you can get this exclusive podcast, or maybe it's a bonus training. If you teach something in your book, you're like, hey, we're going to talk about time management. And if you actually go and pre-order the book, then you're going to get my 4 biggest tips on time management. There's so many different ways that you can spin it, but a private podcast, it really does open up the possibility, because we see a lot of value in that because it's exclusive content. I think there's always value in exclusive content. And so that would be a cool thing. I hope y'all do it. Like,
yeah, I think it would be awesome. Yeah. Cause like you said, I think, videos are cool, right? If you're going to sit down and watch a video, and a lot of people do, right? They don't typically watch the long ones, right? Where we all want to watch those quick ones like we see on TikTok and Instagram Reels and YouTube and things. But yeah, just being able to plug in a podcast when you're in the car or whatever, and be able to listen to that and it be something exclusive. I think that would be super cool. Hey, back to the dynamic content, because I did want to ask you about this, because I know you have been doing like some promo swaps with other podcast hosts. And I think this is something super cool that people may be thinking about starting a podcast, or maybe they're already hosting one, haven't thought about. And it's another great way to get your book in front of other people, other audiences, I think. So will you share a little bit about how you're going about that?
Yeah, for sure. So for anybody that doesn't know, a promo swap is simply just recording something very short. It's between 30 to 90 seconds. So it could be an audio clip where you say, hey, my name's Krystal Proffitt. I'm the host of the Proffitt Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their own podcast. You can check it out at krystalproffitt.com. Okay, let's get into today's episode. So I would record that little snippet for somebody else's show. And I think that the power really comes in because you are giving people an ad, like it's an ad. It is an ad for someone else's show. And when people hear your voice, back to what you were saying earlier, it's like, if I heard the author speak before I ever saw their book, you just have a different connection, because then when you're reading the book, you're like, oh, I know how she sounds. I can actually hear her voice in my head while I'm reading this. And it's just that much more impactful. So I think that that's a really cool way that authors, who knows? You could ask a podcast, especially if you have podcast friends, you could say, hey, if I recorded like a quick audio clip, would you put it in your show? Some of them may say yes. Some of them say no. But I think it's something that you should absolutely consider for your book and for a podcast, because y'all, there are no rules. I don't know if Kim says this on her podcast, but I say it all the time on mine. There are no rules when it comes to what you can and can't do, because a lot of these things are being built out as we speak. A lot of them we're just flying by the seat of our pants, crossing our fingers and hoping that things work. But when they do, we turn around and pay attention and say, wow, that was awesome. Like, why did that work? And just keep asking those questions.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And yes, I do. Every time somebody asks me about podcasting, I'm always like, well, Krystal always says it's your own show. You get to do what you want. If you want to do just a 5-minute solo episode, once a week, or, you want to have an hour episode, whatever you want to do. And it could differ every week. You just got to get out there and try it. And as your tagline says, you just got to start somewhere, right? Get started and just tweak it as you go, and definitely learn as you go, as I'm doing. So this has been so good, Krystal. So I would love for you to share where our listeners can connect with you, because I know you have some fun and exciting things coming up for the new year that you'd love to share with them.
Yeah. So everybody can find me at krystalproffitt.com. That's Krystal with the K, Proffitt with 2 F's and 2 T's. And you can find me there. You can also connect with me on Instagram at Krystal Proffitt TX. And then I'd love for you to come hang out on the Proffitt Podcast or on our YouTube channel. They'll be linked on my website, but I would love for you to tag, take a picture, like a screenshot where you're listening, and tag me and Kim and tell us what you liked about this episode. If you learned something today, we'd love to hear about it for sure.
Yeah, we would love to hear back from you. That would be awesome. Well, thanks so much, Krystal. I appreciate your time today.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me, Kim.
Oh my gosh, y'all, can you see why I love Krystal so much? If you're a podcast host thinking of turning your content into a book, run, don't walk to book a coaching session with Krystal. And hey, hop over to Instagram, because we really love to know what you thought of this episode. I am Kim Stu Inspired, and Krystal is Krystal Proffitt TX. And if you can't remember those, no worries. Just look here in your podcast player where I have linked to both of our profiles on Instagram. And P.S., I didn't even give Krystal a chance to share that her first self-published book was called Rookie Devotionals, A Beginner's Playbook to Prayer and Bible Study. Hello, y'all. I know y'all will love hearing and relating to that. Krystal is your girl. So, hey, thanks for tuning in today, and I'll see you next week as I cheer you on to market your book one podcast at a time.